Welcome to Chopping Board Economics, where cooking brings economics alive. I'm Peter Ormosi from the University of East Anglia. Join me for an episode of Everyday Economics, explained through some of my favourite recipes.
Hi, today we change our usual setting and we move into the garden to make an authentic Hungarian goulash in a cauldron on open fire. Everyone in Hungary knows how to make a goulash and everyone knows it best. A goulash recipe is like a toothbrush. Everybody has one, but nobody likes to use anybody else's. This almost caused a problem at our wedding when we decided to have goulash. To make it the best, it appeared imperative that I was going to make it. Luckily I didn't. Why? For exactly the same reason: trade happens.
Organising a wedding is an incredibly complex task. Historically, much of the work was done entirely by the two families involved, but over time people started specialising and wealth increased. Today, if you organise a wedding, you outsource everything. Why? Because specialised people are better at doing specialised things. Instead of everyone having to do everything on their own, people, businesses and countries specialise in what they're good at and trade. The UK could produce wine, but most would agree that France does it better, so wine is imported from France. When we organised our own wedding, we also outsourced everything. But what about the goulash? As I said before, everyone thinks that they're the best producers of goulash, so why should I trust someone else to make it on such an important day? Luckily, I didn't end up making the goulash. Why? Well, I might think I'm a better cook, but my time was quite valuable on wedding day. How do I value the importance of marrying my wife? Infinitely large. So my cost of cooking goulash on my wedding day and missing my wedding is infinite. On the other hand, the cost of hiring a chef was around £5 an hour, so it was a no-brainer. This logic underlines why trade happens. Even for someone who's best at everything, it makes sense to delegate some of the things to others, so that we can do something more important with our time. Take our goulash ingredients. The UK is probably better at producing beef and onion than most other countries. Yet, a lot of it gets imported. Why? Because other users of the same land are even more profitable than keeping cows or growing onions. Trading our products, skills or time gives us access to a wider range of products and services at a lower price. Moreover, trading benefits all. On my wedding day, I gain from being able to pay for someone else making the goulash. And the caterer gains because he makes a profit.
So trade seems to be a no-brainer. We embrace the benefits of trade in our personal lives, but do we equally embrace it as an economy? I'm not so convinced. Let's look at our ingredients, for example. In its most basic form, a goulash only requires 3 ingredients: meat, onion and paprika. Some people also like to add some tomatoes and pepper and so on. Here I'm using about 1 kilo of diced beef, 3 large onions and about 2 tablespoons of paprika. I'm also going to add some tin tomatoes and some caraway seed. Now, in what follows, I'm going to show you how these ingredients have been affected by policies that restrict free trade. But first of all, let's get back to our hypothetical wedding.
The wedding industry has grown massively. Alone in the UK, we spend around £10 billion on weddings every year. But why are they so expensive? First, for a lot of people it's hoped to be a once-in-a-lifetime event and are willing to pay whatever the price. But there's another reason. Given the nature of services, we inevitably end up hiring local businesses. This is a serious limitation. Think about flowers. Suppose you could choose your florist from all over the world. This would mean more competition for each wedding and you'd get cheaper flowers. Most flower producers would also win by having a huge increase in their business. Moreover, growing roses in Europe results in many times more CO2 emission than, for example, roses produced in Kenya, even accounting for transportation. Trade and its beneficial impact is sometimes limited by simple geography, but other, more political limitations are much more likely. Take our main ingredient, beef, for example. The US beef processing industry is largely concentrated in the hands of 4 American giants. If, for example, Brazil was to export beef into the US, they would have to pay for it. Now imagine that these trade barriers disappear overnight and cheap Brazilian beef is sold off the shelves of US supermarkets. This would increase choice and reduce prices for consumers, but the four food giants would lose out. So to avoid these losses, they will lobby the government to reintroduce the trade barriers that guarantee their profit margin. When governments give in to this sort of pressure, the narrative is often to save the jobs of our fellow citizens. But trade barriers only benefit the businesses protected by them. Most of us, and especially the poor, lose out. Or take another example. A European farmer trying its best to compete with cheap non-EU beef is desperate to offer a competitive price. But if its costs are higher than the price of foreign beef, the European farmer loses money. So what do governments do? European farmers are paid for this loss so that they can come up with a competitive price. Subsidies mean that we pay less for our food but more in our taxes. Subsidies provide around 60% of the revenue for British farmers. But there's a huge problem with these subsidies. For example, eligible landowners receive at least £210 per hectare each year. So if you own a lot of land, you receive a lot of money just for owning land. There are many people who'd be happy to pay to support their local farmers, and I'm one of them. But agricultural subsidies are more likely to go to large rather than small farmers. No wonder large corporations lobby so hard for them. In reality, limitations of trade, such as tariffs or subsidies, achieve little more than redistributing money from the poorest to the wealthiest.
Preparing a goulash is fairly straightforward. Making it in a cauldron is slightly more challenging, but only because you have to keep an eye on the fire. First, chop the onion and the garlic and wait until your logs burn down. Then put some oil in the cauldron and add the onion. Put the cauldron over the fire and saute the onion very slowly until translucent. You can lift or lower the cauldron if the heat is too much or too little. Then take the cauldron off the heat and mix in the paprika and the caraway seeds. Add the meat and the garlic, mix it all together and put it back on the fire. Cook it slowly for about 15 minutes until the meat releases its juices. Then cover the meat with water, add the tinned tomatoes and some bay leaves and put a couple of logs on the fire. Bring it to boil and then cook it on gentle heat for about 3 hours. Put on more logs when needed.
Whilst the goulash is cooking, let's see some more effects of trade. Trade benefits everyone in the long run, but in the short run there are always some losers. For example, the local florist might go out of business if people imported wedding flowers. When machines revolutionized agriculture in the 19th century, millions of people lost their livelihood. But without the Industrial Revolution, most of us would still be labouring on farms. 150 years on, it's clear that introducing machines was a good thing. Machines are similar to foreign producers. They can do our jobs in a cheaper way. Instead of banning them, we should embrace them and think of ways that makes the transition as painless as possible.
Right, it's been cooking for about 2 hours now. Let's have a quick look. The fire looks perfect. I've actually just added a few logs. You can see we don't need to add any water. The juice is getting nice and thick. I reckon maybe another hour and it will be ready. In the meantime, let's get back to economics and see a few more examples of how society responds to trade.
Okay, we've seen how big businesses respond to trade. Now let's see a different response from consumers. Buying local may seem like a noble deed, but it means that farmers end up producing something not because they're the best at it, but because they know that they can sell it even if it costs more to produce. Take corn as an example. In the US, on average, almost 9 metric tons of corn can be produced per hectare. In the UK, this figure is much smaller. If all the corn needed was to be produced in the UK, the same amount of corn would require many times more land. Of course, local production eliminates shipping costs, but the larger land would require more machinery and consequently more carbon emission. Estimates show that if the 40 main US crops and vegetables were all locally sourced, at current levels of consumption, the US would need an additional 60 million acres of cropland, millions of tons of more fertilizers, more chemicals, and much more fuel for running the increased machinery fleet. This would put an enormous burden on our environment, something that would many times outweigh the carbon impact of transporting food. Trading, in this case, can be much more caring for our environment.
Out of all the possible options we have, free trade is probably the best for society, but we mustn't forget about those who fall behind. Caving into rent-seeking is only likely to benefit big businesses. A free and caring society that's made rich by trade is a lot more likely to be able to help. Right, our goulash has been cooking for about 3 hours now. It should be ready. Let's take this off the heat. This looks really good and the juice is nice and thick. As you can see, the meat is very tender, which isn't surprising after 3 hours of cooking. I'll serve it with some dumplings, but you can have it with bread or potatoes. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Stay tuned for more chopping board economics.